everyone. Welcome and thank you to everyone for joining us today on the webinar, an insider review of November's ballot measures. I'm Darby Kernan, the Deputy Executive Director over Legislation at CSAC. I'm joined by Brandon Castillo, a partner at Bicker, Castillo, and Fairbanks. So Brandon, can you start off and tell us about the climate right now with our campaign?
Yeah, I'd say starting at a macro level, there was some question about how big of a ballot measure year that was going to be this year. Of course, last election cycle, we had 17 ballot measures. We had $500 million in spending on political advertising for ballot measures alone. Consider that, $500 million in California.
Crazy.
Just on ballot measures. It's become huge industry. And this year, we're looking not quite to get to that level, but it's another enormous spending year. We're tracking spending at about $300 million. And what is it? It's October 10th, 11th right now. We still have almost a month to go to the election, and we're already spending just on ballot measures alone $300 million. So I think that's point one, is the big spend. But the underlying point is why. We all know that the decisions made by the legislature cost corporations, cost unions, cost the other interests billions of dollars. And so on this ballot, there are a number of big ticket items that will cost the rental housing industry. It'll cost the dialysis industry, the transportation construction industry. Billions of dollars are at stake. So when you look at the outlay there, a couple $100 million in spending is a pretty good investment. And it really has become the fourth branch of government where, a lot of the most significant issues of the day are decided at the ballot. So once again, if you're a voter in California, you're not going to want to go near the television, stay away from your mailbox, and then increasingly you have to stay away from your phones and your laptops because you're just inundated. I was in Los Angeles this week watching the news and watching advertising. It is just, between the ballot measures and then these congressional candidates, it is just swamped with advertising.
Well, and is media changing a little bit? So you used to be able to just spend money on your newspapers and the top three networks. How do you get to everybody now?
Absolutely. It's a great question. TV is still king. If you look at what we're spending money on ballot measures, the best way to reach a broad audience with impactful messaging is still generally TV. And by TV, I mean broadcast, satellite, and cable. But digital is more and more. We're tracking in our polling what percentage of the population doesn't watch TV or primarily gets information through streaming.
Yeah.
And the numbers at about 30% of California voters right now report that they primarily get their information and their programming through streaming. Now, the myth is that, okay, so we only have to do digital and we can move all these advertising away from TV. And that's not the case. The opposite is true. You have to meet people everywhere they are, and that's why you're seeing expenses go up. So if you're an average consumer, I'm watching the evening news, but then I might be streaming a sporting program earlier in the day or on the weekend. I'm looking at my phone, I'm looking at Facebook, and I'm looking at Twitter. So all of these things are competing for the eyeballs, and you have to reach people with a consistent message across all platforms. And that's why we're seeing it's just so expensive to campaign in California.
Totally. Well, let's start talking about some of the initiatives that really impact local government. So I think Prop 6, which CSAC is opposing, maybe you can talk to us a little bit about what the initiative is and what you're seeing out there.
Prop 6, by all accounts, is kind of the big one on the ballot this year. There are other big ones for sure, the rent control initiative, the dialysis that are seeing more spending right now. But in terms of what the political media is sort of latched onto, we don't have a competitive governor's race. We have some competitive statewide, but Prop 6 is kind of the sexy one on the ballot. And that's because it's very simple for people to understand generally. Prop 6 would repeal the recent transportation funding that CSAC and so many others worked so hard to achieve.
Yeah.
Prop 6 does more than that, though. Prop 6 not only repeals the existing funding, but then it requires voter approval on future transportation funding. And the way it was written, it's very narrow, but because it's narrow, it's very broad. Yeah. They said that any fee on the privilege of operating a motor vehicle on the public highways has to go to a statewide vote. So consider that. We're moving to more electric vehicles. We're moving to autonomous vehicles. We're moving to different ways of transport. Anything that the legislature would consider to fund transportation would now have to go to a vote of people. So it would make the business of funding transportation nearly impossible in California because we know voters don't like to tax themselves. So it is certainly a evenly divided electorate when they start off. However, we're seeing a lot of progress as voters understand, if you ask voters, do you like the gas tax? Of course, many say they don't because nobody likes to pay a tax. However, when we're asking voters, do you want to see it repealed? It's a totally different question. And we're seeing voters behave like California voters where Democrats and a lot of decline to state voters don't want to repeal this revenue now that they know that it's in place, if they're convinced that the money's going where it should.
Well, and they're seeing the projects in their communities,
That's
right?
That's
I
absolutely
think
right.
one of the things that we saw at the debate last week or earlier this week was that with the repeal, if it passes, I think the opponents are saying they have a measure in 2 years that could be on the ballot. But what happens to the billions of dollars that we lose over time?
That's right. And you know, we can talk about that other measure. There are a lot of fundamental flaws, particularly from a local government standpoint. It shifts existing resources of transportation. It changes the rules. Our focus right now is in defeating Proposition 6. And you're right. You know, the voters want their roads fixed.
Yeah.
Our polling shows 80% of voters not only support transportation funding, they support additional transportation funding. They realize that there isn't enough money in the system right now because they're seeing their deteriorated roads. Right. The question becomes about, you know, the funding source. Is it gas tax or vehicle fees, which of course people don't necessarily like, but they're willing to tolerate as long as there's a belief that the roads are going to be fixed. And so two things happen. Number one, the voters passed Proposition 69 in June, which was very important to communicate to voters that, you know, dispel this myth that the money's being diverted. It no longer can constitutionally. And then the second important thing is the projects are getting done. There are 6,500 projects. Our polling shows that people are seeing the projects. 3/4 of voters are seeing projects. And that also helps dispel that sort of distrust factor. So if you're a local government in your county, the best thing you can do to prove to your residents that these funds are accountable is to show them the projects.
Right.
And you're all doing a great job. You know, that 6,500 projects list just goes a really long way in showing the voters that the money's going where they want it to go.
And we're seeing counties, even with all Republican boards of supervisors, opposing, taking action to oppose Prop 6 because they're so concerned about the loss of revenue.
Yeah, I mean, we have a saying, there are no Democrat potholes or Republican potholes.
Right.
Transportation historically has been a bipartisan issue.
Yeah.
You know, now we know that some are trying to sort of weaponize the gas tax because, you know, taxes are a different matter. But in general, Republicans and Democrats all want to see the roads fixed. So it's a safe place for a local government official to be, to talk about fixing roads and filling potholes and investing in mass transit. You know, voters just want this stuff. It's so personal to them, you know, whether you're driving your kids to school or in traffic getting to work.
Yeah. Well, and so let's talk a little bit about Prop 5. Can you give me a quick, CSAC is also opposing Proposition 5 because it will impact local government funding, I think $1 billion a year by the LAO. Could you give us a quick rundown of that initiative?
Sure. The politics behind, and you know, I'm not the policy expert, of course. I'm the political hack, but I'll talk a little bit about the policy, but then you could fill in, but get into the politics of that one are really fascinating. The policy, it's a very complicated measure that essentially allows your Prop 13 tax rate to be portable.
Right.
And the thinking is that if you allow, you know, 55 plus to keep their lower tax rate if they move into another home, then they maintain their lower tax rate.
Right. So I could have a home in Fresno that's got a lower tax base and move to a higher tax base income, but have the same property tax value, which will short, and there's no limitations on Prop 5. So it can happen multiple times where currently there's a limitation. But let's talk about the politics of it.
It's fascinating. So on the opposition side, of course, you have this coalition of local governments, of public safety leaders, of others who are really concerned about the lack of funding and the principle behind it. On the one hand, this is almost exclusively funded by the realtors, and you know, it's obvious why realtors would support this. It would, you know, in their minds, it would help catalyze home sales. But we saw some weird stuff go on. They were all in with this, and then all of a sudden, we have not seen a lot of spending at all from the realtors. And in fact, they submit a measure a couple months ago now, or a month or so ago now, for a new measure on the next ballot that I believe they were worried about that fiscal note that they got. So I don't know the policy, but so it's a really interesting one, and I'm not as close to the polling, but I don't think it's as big of a blowout on the no side as originally some folks thought.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting to watch if the realtors come in with additional money in the final weeks here, or it seems to be sort of orphaned. They've put it on the ballot and they're kind of let things see how they shake out.
It seems like the realtors might be more concerned with Prop 10, which is the rent control measure. But just a couple of things on Prop 5 that I know we're concerned about is that I think they thought of their campaign strategy was this is going to address the housing crisis. But for low-income individuals who are trying to purchase a house, they don't really, the results don't seem to net out, and it doesn't add any additional units. And especially for people in poverty, it's not going to be able to affect their purchasing power and buying new homes. And so we actually feel from the housing crisis aspect, it doesn't really address the problem. But Prop 10, the rent control, which CSAC did not take a position on, that gives local governments the ability to take action to allow for rent control in their communities. What are you seeing on that initiative?
That one is one of the big spends, as we anticipated it would be. The rental housing community, the landlords, so to speak, have really come in big. And the latest reports as of yesterday, there's about $70 million in the opposition. But what's interesting is that the proponents have plenty of money too. The supporters of an organization, the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, and we actually went against them last election cycle. They supported Proposition 61, which was a limit on prescription drug costs.
Right.
This organization, the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, is a $1 billion organization. And by all accounts, they do really good work in the space of helping those patients. But their leader is a guy by the name of Michael Weinstein. He's very active. By all accounts, he kind of runs that organization without anybody telling him how to spend the money. It's a nonprofit. But over the last several election cycles, he's spent close to $80 to $90 million on measures that really have nothing to do with AIDS patients.
Right.
He sponsored the pharmaceutical measure here in California. He sponsored a similar pharmaceutical measure in 2017 in Ohio. He sponsored a building sort of restriction measure in LA, Measure S, I believe it was called, last election cycle. And now he's behind this rent control initiative. And say what you will about the merits of it, and I'm not going to speak to the merits, just the politics and the policy. But what an AIDS healthcare organization has to do with affordable housing, it's a little bit of a stretch to me. And I think people are going to start to look at this organization a little more closely because he's contributed this election cycle, that organization, $20 million. And so it's not the $70 million that the opponents have, but they have enough money where they're making this race interesting. As I said, I was in Southern California and I was watching the news broadcasts and the evening shows, and there are wall-to-wall commercials on both sides of that one.
You see it everywhere.
They're everywhere. They are. So, I'm told in the polling that the opposition is starting to surpass the support, and that the odds are, it's a pretty close one is my understanding, but the odds are that they're starting to get some momentum. The opposition has a ton of money as well, and they really front-loaded their media buy, so there are a ton of opposition campaign ads. They're very good ads in my perspective. They're kind of the 1-2 punch, that it's not going to do anything to help the problem.
Right.
And then, of course, they're really attacking homeowners with this message that it's going to limit what you can charge to rent your own home, which is an effective message because, of course, the majority of voters are still homeowners.
Yeah. Well, and so that kind of leads me down a path of what's been happening this year with the initiative process impacting legislation.
Mm-hmm.
It seemed this year that several groups threatened or started to propose initiatives that would leverage the legislature. Is this a pattern? Do you see this going forward?
Absolutely.
What are your thoughts?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, it's always happened, right? I mean, interest groups have always used the threat of an initiative to try to accomplish their legislative objective. In fact, we've done it successfully at CSAC, and I say we as your consultant, and the League of Cities now since 2004, 2006, when we started with what ultimately turned out to be Proposition 1A, which it was the first measure to protect local government revenues, of course. So it's the politics are not new of using the initiative process as sort of a hammer on the legislature. What has changed, though, and this just happened last election cycle, is now interest groups have the ability, even after you submit your signatures, you can withdraw.
Right.
Before, the cutoff was if you submit your signatures in March or April or whenever they're required, you were done. The measures had to go on the ballot. The signatures were considered the property of the people, and you couldn't pull. Well, they changed the law, and now interest groups have until June 28th-ish, the end of June, to withdraw their measures. And so you submit your measure, and you really have nothing to lose, right? Why wouldn't you spend a couple $1,000,000, $3 million to submit a measure, and then you have that entire period of February or March all the way through the end of June, where the legislature is looking at this thing and maybe saying, okay, we've got to fix it. And you saw a couple of measures that were negotiated off the ballot: the lead paint initiative, the privacy initiative. And so last election cycle we didn't see as much of it. This election cycle we saw quite a few measures. Even the realtors measures in Prop 5, we were told that was all part of an effort to try to get a deal in the legislature. So given the stakes, why wouldn't you spend $3-4 million to qualify a measure, knowing that you could pull it back if you didn't like the polling or if you can get a better deal in the legislature? So I think we're going to see even more and more interest groups using this.
We already have, right?
We already have, yeah. And
CMA has a ballot initiative they're circulating on the soda tax.
That's exactly right. The realtors have a new measure. And so as an organization like CSAC, not only do you have to prepare to play defense, that more and more of these ballot measures are going to be facing as a leverage tool, but you should consider this as a proactive strategy, things that you want to accomplish. And in fact, CSAC did that successfully over the realignment funding. If you recall, CSAC didn't go so far as collecting signatures, but showed the money, showed the resources, had a measure, and ultimately negotiated with the governor to get part of it as proposition as one of his in Prop 30, I believe it was, where we got the realignment funding protected. So there's both an offensive use, and then you have to play defense, knowing that this is going to come cycle after cycle. You're going to be facing these ballot measures that are really a leverage tool.
Totally. So a couple of more initiatives. We did one, or propositions we want to talk about. Proposition 1, the affordable housing. Mm-hmm. How are you seeing? What are your thoughts on that? And I guess it's pretty much tied to Proposition 2, the No Place Like Home, which CSAC is supporting both of those initiatives.
Yeah. So these are kind of like the forgotten measures on this ballot, but there are 4 bond measures, and they're not insignificant in the total dollar amounts. Between the children's hospital funding, there's 2 affordable housing measures, of course, and then there's this other water bond. We have tens of billions of dollars in bonds again that the voters are going to be seeing. The voters have proven very willing to pass bonds, especially if they're for causes like housing, that is the top of every poll I'm seeing. Housing affordability and homelessness are at the top of every poll. So I suspect I've seen some polling that Propositions 1 and 2 will pass, and I think they'll pass pretty comfortably. They don't have a lot of money behind those campaigns, but there's no funded opposition that we've seen, and so I think those measures are likely to pass unless something happens. Housing is just such a big issue for the voters.
Right, and CSAC worked on homelessness this year, and it was our #1 priority, and we're happy for a lot of the work we got done through the legislative process, but these initiatives will help keep moving that forward and are needed. Proposition 3, can you talk a little bit about that, the water bond?
Prop 3 is, it seems like every couple of election cycles we have a new water bond on the ballot. Of course, the legislature placed a water bond on the last ballot, on the June ballot, which voters approved. This one is different. It wasn't put on the ballot by the legislature. This was put on the ballot by interest groups. The main funders behind this are environmental organizations that are more conservation organizations that use funds to put lands into trust. Water agencies, of course, agencies can't fund the campaign, but the water districts are strongly supportive of it. Many of them are, and agricultural interests, because one of the complaints from the water community and the agricultural community was that the last water bond didn't have actual water projects, water storage projects, pipeline projects. None of this money can go to the Delta tunnels, by the way. They're very clear about that.
That helped in CSAC supporting the measure.
Right, so it did. I can imagine, yeah. They were very smart there. But this is one of those measures that was put together by a guy by the name of Jerry Merrill, who's been in and around of water politics for as long as I've done this, for 20 years. And he puts these measures together where he'll stitch funding sources around to appeal to different groups. And so it's got pretty bipartisan support. I haven't looked at the policy as closely as probably you have, but it seems to have a nice smattering of things that voters want: clean water programs, land conservation, environmental conservation, water for agriculture, increased water for cities. So it seems to be a pretty holistic measure in the things that it funds. And right now, the opposition campaign seems to be driven by the Sierra Club and others, there's a little bit of a divide in the environmental community, is my understanding.
Yeah.
The Sierra Club is the main opposition from what I've been able to see, where there are environmental organizations supporting it on the other side.
Right.
But I don't anticipate that either side is going to have a ton of money based on what's seen so far. I think the proponents have $5 or $6 million, which may seem like a lot of money, but it really isn't in California when you talk about it. And then I haven't seen any significant funding or advertising from the opposition side.
Well, and an initiative or a proposition that doesn't have any money on either side is Proposition 7, the daylight savings proposition, which if you vote yes, you're voting to get rid of it. Have you seen initiative? I mean, that's kind of a fun one, right? Like,
fun, yes, but is this really? I mean, voters tire of ballot measures. Here's the thing: we do research on this all the time. Voters think the initiative system is flawed. They think they're voting on too many measures that aren't relevant to their lives. But they want to vote.
Right.
Voters love to vote. If you poll voters, hey, should we change the initiative system to take away or limit your right to vote? They're very protective of their right to vote. It's become the fourth branch of government. So this daylight savings one is a little bit of a head scratcher. I don't know if there's a daylight savings lobby that I've been unaware of this whole time. There's
been a bill every year.
There's been a bill every year. So people feel very passionately about it. My understanding is keeping it means our mornings will stay darker and our evenings will stay a little lighter in the night. Did I get that right?
I think so.
Okay, all right.
We'll see what happens in November.
I mean, the alarm clock industry is going to make a killing because more and more people are hitting the snooze button. I think as it's darker, children are going to be walking to school in the dark. I could actually see a really but a really impactful campaign where you have kids waiting for the school bus, at 8 in the morning in dark. I mean, that would be a pretty great commercial, but nobody's hired us to do that.
That's right. We can't lower the voting age this year.
No, that's right. That's right. I'll talk about a couple of the other measures that we haven't touched on that are somewhat big and somewhat very industry specific.
Okay.
One of the major ones that I'm sure if you're watching TV in California or at your mailbox, Proposition 8. And full disclosure, I'm working the opposition to Proposition 8 on behalf of a broad coalition that includes the dialysis clinic industry. It includes the California Medical Association, the nurses, the ER doctors, versus on the other hand, you have the Service Employees International Union, United Healthcare Workers West. And again, full disclosure, I'm working the opposition, so take what I say with a little bit of a grain of salt.
No, but a lot of people have been asking about this initiative.
Why am I looking at dialysis? Why am I seeing tens of millions in advertising on dialysis? This is an example of the initiative process being used to try to accomplish another objective. In this instance, SEIU UHW has a history before they were targeting the hospital industry, and now they're targeting the dialysis industry where they're trying to organize the workers. And I take no position on whether they should organize the workers. Unions have their role, but they're using the ballot measure as leverage. So this measure is essentially a financial price caps on the industry that would be crippling.
Yeah.
And so the industry has no choice but to run, tens of millions of dollars in advertising because it's going to literally not only cripple the industry but their patients by forcing the shutdown of many of these clinics. Again, this is a measure that's on the ballot because of a dispute between a labor union and corporations. And now voters are voting on an issue of dialysis, which frankly, most voters have no idea about dialysis. And why am I voting on this? So it's again, the abuse, or some would say the abuse of the initiative system, that voters are now left to decide a pretty heavy policy issue that could have major implications on one side or the other.
Do you see that impact of kind of the voters getting annoyed or exhausted from this, that they then just go and vote no down the whole ballot? Or is that a fear? Is that a myth?
It's a good question. We get it every election cycle. We've done the analysis, and the answer is just no. There's no evidence that there is like a big wave of no voters. Voters are pretty discerning. They pick their way through the ballot. If you look at last election cycle, we had 17 measures. There were measures at the tail end of that ballot that were passing. There were measures at the beginning that were voting. Voters sorted out some pretty confusing, the death penalty initiative. There were competing measures. The plastic bag ban, there were competing measures, and voters figured out, okay, I want to keep the death penalty. I don't want to loosen it. And they voted, they're very discerning. So what we do see is we see a drop off from the number of voters who vote on the gubernatorial ballot versus ballot propositions, but it's not as big of a drop off as you would see. We see anywhere between 4 to 6% drop off. That's people that go to vote for governor that decide not to vote on the ballot propositions. Okay. It's a little higher in presidential years because people show up to vote for the president and then they won't vote for the ballot measures. But people generally, they do their civic duty and they vote They pick their way through the ballot and they figure these things out.
Right. What were a couple of others? Did you have a couple more that you want to talk
Yeah,
about?
Proposition 11 is an interesting one because I'm sure people are starting to see ads about Prop 11.
Right.
And the policy, I'm not as clear on the policy. It has to do with meal and meal and rest periods for EMT employees.
I believe they're private, targeting the private EMT, but counties do contract with the privates, so it does impact local government in a way.
Yeah, and so the politics behind that in terms of the funding, that's another measure that if you turn on your TV, you're seeing quite a few of those ads with ambulances. And the Prop 11 folks have spent $22 million. So one company, American Medical Response, which is the predominant private ambulance company in California, apparently this is a big enough financial issue for them, paying meal and rest periods or whatever, that they're willing to spend $22 million on a ballot measure. Again, the voters are looking at this thing. It's kind of a head scratcher. Why am I voting on meal and rest periods for ambulance workers? But they must have tried in the legislature and decided they couldn't pass, so they're taking it directly to the people. Yeah. And again, this is a strategy that interest groups are using more and more now. If you can't get what you want out of the legislature, design a ballot measure that you think you can send to the voters.
Yeah, it's scary in some ways when you see the 2020 ballot or the election with the presidential, and we're already starting to see people circulating measures to put on there to hopefully leverage the legislature in between. It gets a little concerning.
It does, but don't expect it to go away.
Yeah.
It does, but don't expect it to go away. The ballot measure industry is just that. It is an industry in and to itself. These things don't end up on the ballot by accident. I've worked with CSAC and many, many other clients. I've been doing this for 20 years. And just know that before a measure ever gets submitted, there is so much legal work, policy work, polling done, coalition building. It's a very sophisticated industry. You don't put a measure on the ballot if you don't think it's going to pass. And likewise, the opposition campaigns, we just spend an enormous amount of effort to either pass or defeat measures because the stakes are so high. So it's, just like you have very experienced and great lobbyists running around influencing the legislature, you have very experienced ballot measure consultants, and this is all we do for a living.
Right.
And so the stakes are really high.
Well, and one question we did receive is, what does the recent polling say about Prop 6?
The polling on Prop 6 is interesting. There was a public poll released last week that showed that a majority of voters, a slim majority, but a majority of voters would oppose it when they read that ballot label. Yeah. And people keep asking me, how is that so? The gas tax, it's highly unpopular. Why is it that voters are looking to reject Prop 6? To be clear, our campaign is very worried. We're not resting on our laurels. We believe this is going to be a very close election. This is a highly contentious issue. So get out there on private time, not on public time. Spread the word about the importance of these local transportation improvements in your community. They're going to be lost because voters need to hear about it. But I believe this is going to be a close election. However, the reason people are right now, slim majorities are opposing Prop 6 is because it's not just about repealing the gas tax. That's not the question that voters are going to be asked. Remember, there's a consequence to this. Voters are being told, do you want to eliminate these transportation revenues? And if so, do you want to eliminate funds that are going to transportation projects? The ballot label and the fiscal note give both sides of the equations. It's going to eliminate a tax, but then it's also going to eliminate a revenue source.
Right.
California voters, as I said, they start to behave more like Democrats and decline to states and Republicans when the question is posed that way, when people realize, hey, it's not just a vote on the gas tax, it's a vote on eliminating funding for transportation, which people want.
Right.
And so we've seen the polling is very close. It's going to be a close election, which is why our side is doing everything we can to spread the word. But it's, right now it's a toss-up essentially.
Well, and there is no requirement that gas prices get lowered if this initiative was to pass, right?
That's a very good point. No, this simply repeals the recent gas tax increase, but it doesn't mandate that oil companies or oil retailers reduce gas prices. And we've seen the biggest elasticity in pricing has nothing to do with this 12-cent per gallon tax.
Right.
It has to do with oil production and refinery issues. We're seeing gas prices go up when they normally don't go up this time of year, and it's because refineries are down for maintenance. There are global oil production issues going on. So no, there's no guarantee that it'll lower gas prices. There is a guarantee that it's going to eliminate $5 billion per year, including billions for local governments.
Right. One question we did get is, what about Prop 9? Why isn't there one on the ballot? I actually don't know the answer to that.
The courts took it off. The courts threw it off, and that's that's a very unusual thing for the courts to do. Prop 9 would have, of course, divided California into 3 states. Before that, it was 5 states, and before that, the measure was 7 states, I believe. So they keep getting smaller. Eventually, I think we'll be 1.5 states if they have their way.
I know.
But so they qualify. Prop 9 was qualified for the ballot. That's why it was given a proposition number. But opponents sued, claiming it was unconstitutional, and they were successful. And that's a very unusual thing. The courts usually aren't. They usually won't take pre-election challenges. They'll wait until a measure is passed or not by the voters. They don't like to preempt things. They don't like to waste their time, essentially. Right. And so it's very unusual for the courts to issue a pre-election ruling like this. But they did take the step. It happened after the Secretary of State had numbered measures and told. So we now just have a blank spot on the ballot where Proposition 9 was.
Got it. Kind of going back to Prop 5, we didn't talk about that polling. I know that's considered kind of a close one. Do you have any polling data on that one?
I do, and the polling that we see is it's closer than I had thought. It's closer than I was told. The opposition is ahead a little bit, but I am told that the polling is close. It'll be interesting, I think, to watch the politics. Going back to my point that the realtors have seemed to not, I don't want to say orphaned it or abandoned it, but we haven't seen any advertising. And here we are, voting starts this week, and we haven't seen any advertising in support of the measure. I've seen some in opposition now. It'll be interesting to see if the polling really is. I've seen one poll, so I don't read too much into one poll, especially ones that were given to me third hand.
Right.
But it was closer than I anticipated. It'll be interesting to see if the realtors see the similar stuff in their polling, or if their polling shows that it's dead and they continue to not spend any money on actual advertising.
Right. And do you see with those measures that kind of don't have any advertising, is there a prediction of whether those pass or fail on average historically? Like if there's no campaigns behind it and not a lot of spending, is there a
percentage?
Yeah.
The rule of thumb used to be that 2/3 of ballot measures in California fail. The number of measures that are passing now has increased for a very specific reason, and that's people are getting smarter about what they're putting on the ballot. So if I'm an interest group, I'm not going to spend the millions of dollars to put this on the ballot unless I've poll tested it. I know I have the resources to pass it. And so, the rule of thumb is still that measures fail more than they pass. But when you see these yes campaigns, a lot of them are passing, especially some of these bond measure campaigns that the label are things that California voters support, clean water, invest in the water bond, invest in agricultural water. So I think a lot of these non-funded measures will actually pass this election cycle, the bond fund. We haven't talked about the Children's Hospital bond.
Right.
Here, the children's hospital industry has come in. I believe they've spent, or they've raised, $10 million. So here's an industry to fund children's, hospital repairs. I think that one in seismic safety. So I think, children, seismic safety. It's a pretty compelling message if you can deliver it. So I actually think this election cycle, you're going to see a number of these measures, even the ones that don't have a lot of money behind them, pass.
Well, and with Governor Brown being a popular governor and on his way out, has he been weighing in on a lot of measures or campaigning or spending any of his war chest on initiatives this year?
The governor has been, as he always is, the governor picks and chooses his spots. He knows that a brand only has so much, oomph. Yeah. And so this election cycle, the transportation measure is the one the governor is focused on. You know that. Yeah, you know how much the governor, he is calling every day, trying to generate support, trying to fundraise. And I think you'll probably see him, more publicly in later days as we get closer to the election. The governor has not given any of his money at this point. I don't know if he will, candidly, but he's doing an awful lot on Proposition 6 to ensure its defeat. And without the governor's involvement, we wouldn't be near where we are now. We'd be in a lot worse place. The governor, he's said publicly, very publicly, that he's not inclined to spend his money if he doesn't need to. He doesn't want to become a lame duck after he's out of office. I know the governor still has, ambitions of getting involved politically after he's out of office on issues that he cares about, climate issues, public safety issues. And he's proven to be very frugal. The governor is very, very frugal. So I don't know how much, if any, of his dollars he'll put directly in, but the other work that he's doing is just invaluable.
Yeah, no, I agree. Well, and that kind of, with you mentioned earlier that absentee ballots are coming out and people can start to vote. Do you see any concern with the motor vote problems with DMV happening or the new system of absentee voting kind of being in place. Are there any concerns there about how that could impact the election?
Yeah, so there are two things that we're talking about. One is this whole automatic voter registration, which has just been fascinating to watch, somewhat painful to watch, the recent news.
Yes.
Let's table that for a minute.
Okay.
The voters' choice counties, we have a number of counties, Sacramento County, San Mateo County, and other counties that everybody is now an absentee voter. Even I'm a precinct voter, but I get my ballot in the mail, and you have the choice of either mailing it in before the election or dropping it off at these sort of voter super centers, right? You don't have your neighborhood precinct stations anymore. You have larger stations in fewer locations. In the June election, if I'm not mistaken, there was an increased turnout in Sacramento County and other counties. However, it was just one election cycle, and we don't know if that was because there was competitive races, on the ballot, if there are other factors. So what is clear, though, is that voters are voting by mail at far greater margins. And so it used to be under 50%. It used to be 40%. Now we're seeing numbers in the 60% threshold of people voting by mail. Yeah, it's great. It hasn't necessarily increased turnout per se. It's just the same people that are voting differently. But it has changed campaigns. Yeah. It used to be, there was election day. You would start your advertising 2 or 3 weeks before. Now, since a good chunk of voters are going to be voting in that, week or two after they first get their ballots, it's election month. And that's why you're seeing advertising starting just after Labor Day in mid-September, because campaigns have to influence the voters before they get those ballots in the mail. Now, it's not like everybody receives their ballot this week and everybody mails it in right away. We're procrastinators, right?
By nature.
By nature. So most ballots start to return about 1 or 2 weeks out by mail. And so you still have a little time as a campaign, but certainly there's a reliable chunk of voters who will submit their ballots within that first week. So we now have election month, and as campaigns, every vote counts. And in a race that's going to be close, you can't afford to lose even 5 or 6% of the electorate who's going to be voting in those first couple of weeks.
Right. Hopefully the Taylor Swift, Kanye West will really help kind of get those voters.
Sure. Yeah. This time it's going to work. This time it's going to work. This is going to be the season.
Well, and then on the absentee ballots and the longer period, are you seeing campaign season last even longer then? So your work doesn't start, I remember as a legislative employee, the get out the vote, the last 4 days was the critical time. Has that shifted and it's much longer now?
Absolutely shifted, yeah. We see, again, people can vote for an entire month, but then the real action starts about 2.5 weeks out, where you just see this surge of people making up their mind, putting in their ballots. And so we're also, with data, we've gotten so much more sophisticated than the other day. So we know if we're going to be precinct walking or phone banking or doing anything to communicate with voters, we know by their voter history, not only, sort of how they vote by mail or in person, but how early they vote.
Right.
And so we're able to target, so we're not walking precincts, knocking on doors 3 weeks out of somebody, who's going to vote at the polls, but rather we're very sophisticated in the targeting of people, especially on digital. I mean, you can vote, you can target not specific voters, but clusters of voters based on their voting history. So, for instance, we run our digital campaigns early to voters that we know have a history of voting early, and then we wait a little longer for poll voters to start communicating with them.
Got it. Well, I think that, are there any initiatives maybe or propositions that we haven't covered that we should be thinking of that you can recall?
Yeah, some of your counties, your more rural counties and farm communities might care about Proposition 12. This is the next layer of the animal confinement initiatives. If you remember, we passed, I think it was Proposition 2 some years ago, that was the chicken confinement measure. And that passed. And in that instance, the agricultural community spent quite a bit of money to try to defeat it. The Humane Society was the major proponent behind it, and it passed. This measure is a follow-up. I think it expands the number of animals where there are confinement, practices where you can't confine them in certain spaces. And it's really, the last time it got a lot of attention.
I think, isn't PETA opposing this initiative?
Yeah, there's some split between the between the animal welfare community that I'm not that close to, but it's really flown under the radar screen. But they've raised, some money behind that one. It's predominantly the Humane Society, and looking here, they've raised, close to $10 $10 million behind that. There's an active philanthropy and donor base behind these, animal welfare measures. So, you've already started to see some ads. In my opinion, they're very well done. They show animals in crates struggling, and then they show a family farmer. So pretty well done. I haven't seen any polling on that one, but I think some of your more rural counties, and all people, who eat food, I guess, would probably care about that one.
Right. All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. So we want to thank you, and get out and vote on Election Day or before.
Or now. Get out and vote now.
There you go.